Okay, everyone, I believe it is now time to start. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tammy Gill, planner on the Quadra McKenzie plan, and will be facilitating the webinar today. We'd like to welcome you to the first webinar for the presentation of the draft plan for Quadra McKenzie that's now out for public consultation. I would like to remind attendees that the webinar is recorded and will be posted online within the next day or so to our saanich.ca/QMS webpage to ensure that folks who can't attend are able to watch at a time that works best for them. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded, as the webinar did flash a post in the beginning to indicate that it's a recorded event. Now I would like to do the territorial acknowledgement. As we all know, the district of Saanich lies within the territories of the Lekwungen peoples, represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and the Wasanich peoples, represented by the Sartlip, Paquachin, Tsewut, Sakum, and Malahat nations. The First Peoples have been here since time immemorial, and their history in this area is long and rich. I will now run through some basic webinar protocol and what to expect. As a reminder, the District of Saanich is a respectful workplace, and respectful conduct is expected from all participants in this webinar. We welcome everyone to participate and want to make sure that this is a positive experience where everyone has an opportunity to be heard, even when we don't agree with what they're saying. Disrespectful behavior, including bullying, harassment, or discrimination, will not be tolerated. Examples of this behavior include, but are not limited to, written or verbal comments, actions, gestures, etc. Use of profanity. As there is a zero tolerance for this behavior, attendees could be kicked out of the session and/or the webinar could be concluded at that time if things get out of hand. We note that the plan is at a draft stage and that feedback from the community will be considered as the plan is refined. There are multiple ways to express your perspectives on the plan, and we encourage you to all stay involved. The best way to do that is to complete the online survey, which is available until November 26th online. Feedback can also be provided by submitting an email to qms@saanich.ca. For more information on engagement opportunities, those can also be found on our website at saanich.ca/QMS. Moving on to the presentation and what to expect. Staff will present a high-level overview of the draft plan and will proceed to a standard question and answer session at the end. Throughout the presentation, there's an opportunity to post your questions on the screen. I'd suggest holding on a little because your question may be spoken to later on in the presentation. We also ask that attendees pay attention to questions of similar nature being asked so we don't have many repeat questions. The questions also can be upvoted with a like button, and those with the most upvotes will be answered. Staff will do their best to get through as many questions as possible, but don't worry if your question is not answered. The questions that are asked will be compiled, answered, and posted online as an FAQ on, again, saanich.ca/QMS for people to refer back to if theirs was not answered in the allotted time we have remaining for the webinar. At this point, I would like to introduce my colleague, Manager of Community Planning, Scott, to walk you through the draft Quadra McKenzie plan.
Thank you, Tammy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So we have a fair bit to get through today, and appreciate you taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the Quadra McKenzie plan, and hopefully you'll engage in it further through the survey or other mechanisms. So we're hoping to do a couple things today. Firstly, provide some background and context on the draft Quadra McKenzie plan process. Some of you maybe haven't been involved at earlier stages, but some of you may be coming into this process at this time. So we'll provide some context on that in terms of what the plan's about, what's been done so far, and what are some of the key policy and context that's driving it. Next, we'll share some of the key directions of the draft plan. It's an over 100-page document, so there's a lot to digest, but we'll provide kind of some of the high points and point you in directions that you may be interested for further exploration. As Tammy mentioned, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and then we'll also share opportunities about how to further engage in the process. So just in terms of who's here today, we have a variety of staff to deliver this presentation, but also help with questions. So myself, Tammy, and Adam Smith are part of the core project team for the Quadra McKenzie plan in the planning department, and we also have Megan Squires as an engineering representative to help answer some of the questions that you may have. around some of the transportation changes that are planned in the plan and in the future in the area. So at the end, we will collectively work to answer some of your questions. So I'll start off briefly with the project context and starting off with what the plan is about. Essentially, the Quadra McKenzie plan is something that a plan that looks to guide growth and change over the next 20 years, and really maybe slightly different than some of the previous plans that Saanich has undertaken for local areas. It really is almost exclusively focused on land use and transportation. We have the benefit of a recently updated official community plan that was endorsed earlier this year. And what the Quadra McKenzie plan really looks to do is take some of those broader directions in our official community plan and land them at the local level. Critically, the Quadra McKenzie plan area contains 40% of what we call our primary growth areas in the official community plan, our centers, corridors, and villages. So it really is an area where we're looking to address a lot of our future housing and employment growth, and that's reflected in the plan directions. The area that we're considering as part of the plan really is framed by our two key corridors, the McKenzie corridor from the Pat Bay Highway to the University of Victoria, and the Quadra corridor from the Pat Bay Highway to the City of Victoria boundary at Tolmie Avenue. As part of this study, we've looked at areas roughly within 500 meters of that corridor, looking to capture a lot of the residences and properties that are within a 5-minute walk of frequent or rapid transit. So this was our initial boundary for the area. The boundaries have been refined based on a number of different characteristics in the area, such as the agricultural land reserve, or where there's perhaps environmentally sensitive areas or key destinations. So this was the initial study area we looked at, and as we move along, we were able to refine that. Okay, so the Quadra McKenzie plan really identifies a number of key center corridor, includes a number of center corridor and village areas that are identified in the official community plan, there's a couple identified here: the Quadra McKenzie Center, the Shelburne McKenzie Center, the Gordon Head McKenzie Center, which is new and identified through this planning process, as well as the McKenzie Corridor and Quadra Corridor and Four Corners Village. So these are all very important areas in terms of the future growth of the municipality of Saanich and areas where we're looking to concentrate future population and employment growth. One of the elements that's been added in the Quadra McKenzie plan is this idea of corridor hubs. So in between those centers and villages, there's often large gaps between access to services and amenities. And over the long-term horizon of this plan, which is 20 to 30 years, we're looking to add hubs that include commercial services like coffee shops or community services like daycares that help to support the needs of local residents within walking distance. So you can see those smaller blue circles. The screen with the presentation, I'm seeing kind of half and half, so it would just help me if you don't mind doing that. Thank you. So there's a number of things that are framing this this plan, and Saanich has completed a lot of work in the last 10 years to really help guide our transportation plan, which are really critical influences in terms of setting our goals for where we want to go as a community. Um, Additionally, there's a number of provincial and regional influences. A number of you are probably aware of some of the recent provincial regulatory changes and also housing targets that have been assigned municipalities. So there's a much greater emphasis on addressing the housing crisis and ensuring that we're providing new housing units that can meet community demand. Additionally, there's the regional influences such as BC Transit's planning around rapid bus and frequent transit that this plan is able to align with and move forward. In terms of the official community plan, there's 4 key land use directions that are included in that plan, and those are important guidance for the development of the Quadra McKenzie plan. The first one is to maintain the urban containment boundary. So Saanich as a municipality is about 50% urban and about 50% rural agricultural. So there's been a strong commitment from council to align with that. And what that means is within the urban containment boundary, there's a need for a greater amount of growth. Um, the entire study area for the Quadra McKenzie boundary is within the urban containment boundary. There's one portion that is adjacent to the Blenkinsop Valley, so that's one area where we need to pay attention to those transitions, but also perhaps capitalize on some of the access to agricultural land there and that economic development opportunity. The second direction is to accommodate most new development in primary growth areas. And these are the centers, corridors, and villages. And when we look at the Quadra McKenzie area as a whole, that's considered to be a primary growth area in its entirety. So it's either within a center, a village, or a corridor. So this is a really critical area for us to accommodate new housing and employment growth in locations that are accessible to transit and active transportation networks, and also in the longer term or immediately walkable to a range of services and amenities. Also complementing that direction is the desire to expand housing diversity in neighborhoods. So this is largely achieved through some of the small scale multi-unit housing regulation, but also will be looked at through future initiatives in areas like Gordon Head and Kerry, where they're not close to corridors, but they're also provide an opportunity to further diversify the housing stock. The last strategic direction in the OCP, land use direction in the OCP, is making Saanich a 15-minute community. And that really relates to incrementally increasing the range of services and amenities within the walking distance of residences throughout the urban areas of Saanich. So a number of areas in the Quadra McKenzie areas, so think maybe closer to Shelburne McKenzie, there really is good access to a range of these elements. But other areas such as North Quadra, there's changes that are needed to improve this walkable access, and that's one of the things that the plan tries to deliver on. Another critical element is housing and our housing strategy. The housing strategy includes 7 focus areas, and one of the key things that this plan tries to deliver is looking at not only housing supply, but are there opportunities to encourage a range of tenures and diversity and affordability levels, and really look at ways that we can meaningfully address this in this area. Really informing all of the work that we're doing here is the recent provincial housing directions, both in terms of regulatory changes, but also in terms of the housing targets that have been assigned to Saanich. So we have a 5-year target of 4,600 units over the 5 years, so occupancy for 4,600 units, and that represents a roughly tripling of our historical development output. So this is one area where we can really make meaningful progress on some of those housing targets, and not only from a supply perspective, but also looking at that range of different housing types. So the Quadra McKenzie study itself and how we've got to the plan here is a multi-phase process that was initiated approximately about 1.5 years ago. So we've gone through a number of different phases, from project initiation, where there was a lot of background research and analysis, to phase 2, where we looked at concept and plan development in phase 2A, 2B. We're currently at the point where we have a draft plan out for public input. And then subsequent to that, there'll be a finalization process where we'll be taking the plan to council and having them consider it for adoption. The directions you see in the draft plan that I'll be sharing shortly here are really founded on some fairly extensive engagement that occurred earlier on in the process. And really the 2 key priorities of earlier engagement will really to get a sense of key issues and opportunities in the study area, and then to get some initial feedback on land use and transportation concepts. And this occurred through a range of in-person and online tools. So everything from workshops to online mapping and webinars to open houses and other events like that. And then targeted meetings with different groups that had different perspectives to share in terms of their expertise in the area. And briefly touching on just two of those kind of key engagement activities. There was a story mapping portal that was opened where people were able to input information on what they currently love about the area and what they'd like to see changed. So this is an example of some of the feedback that was received, and each dot represents kind of a comment or key area that folks felt needed to be addressed. There was a variety of different categories there in terms of land use, transportation, housing, and public realm and open space. In the December-January period, there was a number of interactive workshops that were held at Reynolds Secondary School with fairly strong participation from a range of community members. And this was an opportunity to really look at some of the emerging concepts that we had in the plan and some of the land use and transportation preliminary directions. So there was really some really strong feedback received there. There was also a survey to complement that, and that really helped provide some of the basis for the directions that are in the plan today. So now I'm going to transition to a bit of a summary of the draft plan itself and what's contained. As I mentioned, this is a fairly extensive document, and this summary will really provide a bit of an orientation and a high-level overview of some of the key concepts. You may want to explore the plan in greater detail and or provide feedback on areas or items that you're more interested in, but hopefully this provides a bit of an orientation to you for the plan. So the plan includes four key goals related to land use, transportation mobility, housing diversity, affordability, supply, and public realm and open space. So when we look at land use, a lot of it's implementing this OCP vision of the center corridor and village growth management framework. From a transportation perspective, the McKenzie Avenue and Quadra Street corridors are really the key focus, but also looking to broadly enhance connectivity and active transportation options in the area. From a housing perspective, as I mentioned before, we have our direction from the housing strategy, which really frames a lot of the work that's in here. And then lastly, around public realm and open space, looking at ways that we can support growth in a way that maintains and enhances community livability. The plan includes 9 key directions, and these are intended to provide a sense of what some of the big moves or key points of emphasis are in the plan. So I'll briefly go over them. The first one is to implement rapid transit on the McKenzie corridor. So the McKenzie corridor is identified in BC Transit's long-term plans as a key priority implementation corridor to implement rapid transit and really improve the quality of service to kind of meet or exceed that of personal vehicles and really improve the transit rider experience through improved station areas and other things. So a lot of our work has been trying to align that land use change with these transportation improvements and ensuring any future designs really accommodate this. And McKenzie already is quite a frequently used transit corridor, but a lot of the projections indicate that it will be used to a much greater extent in the future. The second key direction is around connecting the University of Victoria to urban Saanich. So University of Victoria is this great asset that we have in Saanich, and one of the things the plan looks to do is really connect it to Saanich. So right now, if you think of that intersection at Gordon Head and McKenzie, there's an opportunity for some public realm, land use, transportation changes to really stitch those two areas together. And to that extent, that area has been identified as one of our new centers, which is a higher density node of growth. And a lot of that the success of that area will be dependent on that interrelationship with University of Victoria. I alluded to this earlier, but the third key direction is introducing corridor hubs to expand walkable 15-minute neighborhoods. So these are at different points along Quadra and McKenzie. In some instances, there's already a commercial use there that we can build on. In other instances, we're essentially trying to add that community corridor hub in there, where it's primarily residential right now. So really looking to expand that range of services and amenities within walking distance. The fourth direction is expand housing in locations near high frequency transit. So this is really looking at those opportunities that we can capture along those Quadra McKenzie corridors where we know there'll be consistent, reliable transit service coming at high frequencies. And this will help us meet some of our climate and housing goals as well. The fifth direction, which I'll get into a little bit later, is looking to use density incentives to obtain desired community amenities. So generally, when development comes forward, there's a number of things that we're trying to achieve on site in terms of housing or environmental outcomes. And what this density framework potentially does is provide an incentive-based pathway to achieve better outcomes when development comes forward. The next item is providing greater housing diversity near parks. So if you think of a lot of our higher density housing right now, it's often on busier streets. So one of the key elements of the plan is, are there more recreational parks? So not necessarily the natural parks, but the recreational parks where we can provide more housing, particularly family-oriented housing in locations that are perhaps more conducive to families with children or seniors, and provide that amenity value and really help to animate those parks as well. Number 7 is celebrate the Lochside Trail as a community asset. It comes right through the study area, so looking at ways that we can improve the Lochside Trail for a range of modes, make it safer, more reliable, and also look at opportunities for us to actually provide those connection points so that it can be leveraged as a community asset. Enhancing Quadra as a complete street. So right now, the design of Quadra includes fairly narrow sidewalks, no bike lanes, and no transit priority. So a lot of the work in this project will look to ways that we can redesign that street to meet a broader range of interests. And lastly, is revitalize the Saanich Operations Center with a greater mix of uses. So there's a parallel process ongoing to re-envision what the Saanich Operations Center, or some of you may know as the Saanich Public Works Yard, as a renewed facility that provides land and buildings that will support the continued operation of Saanich's infrastructure and other needs, but also looking at ways that can be a more deliberate part of that Quadra McKenzie Center, and include uses that are conducive and fit in with that higher density commercial residential mixed use future. So a big part of this is looking at ways to integrate that, ways to celebrate some of the public realm features like the creek there, and look at that range of uses. Briefly, the plan includes a number of different chapters. So some of the framing elements around the introduction and key plan goals. The 3 core content areas that are addressed are land use, transportation, and parks, trails, open spaces, and community facilities. And then there's chapters on the McKenzie corridor and the Quadra corridor, and specifically some directions around the sub areas around those corridors. This is an extremely large area. It's, I think, in some of the comparison I've done, it's larger than the municipality of Esquimalt. So it's important for the plan to be effective to include policy that responds to some of those unique attributes in different areas. So getting into the land use framework, which is really a critical part of these area plans, and really helps to set the stage for decision making on what types of development should happen in the area in the future going forward. It builds on the broader land use designations of the community plan. So I mentioned the centers, corridors, and villages. They provide some broad parameters for development in terms of building height and use. And what this plan does is really takes some of those broad parameters and provides direction on a parcel by parcel basis on the type of building height, density, use that would be appropriate in those areas. Critically, it links land use and transportation. So looking at the potential changes on McKenzie and Quadra and ensuring that the land use is there to support that in terms of commercial uses, public realm space, population densities that are consistent with some of the transit service that's envisioned. Another key element of the land use framework is special sites that have been identified based on site features or distinct uses. So these are identified as hatched areas, and they can contain specific objectives that are looked to be achieved in these areas. And essentially, they're identified for special consideration if any development comes forward. And as I mentioned before, another key part of that land use framework is the density framework, which seeks to incentivize key outcomes. And at this point is kind of a standalone supplement to the Quadra McKenzie plan that we're taking out for public engagement and getting feedback on. So this is the map that contains a lot of the important elements of the Quadra McKenzie plan, and each color identifies a specific land use designation. And as I mentioned, the type of development that's envisioned. A couple things to note here is the higher density areas are included in those centers and villages. So you have the Quadra McKenzie Center, the Shelburne McKenzie Center, and the Gordon Head McKenzie Center. So those are the three highest density areas that are envisioned in this area. The dark red would permit up to 18-story buildings. And then we also have the Four Corners Village, which is really another critical pre-existing commercial node that we will look to build on and encourage a greater mix of uses. The blue designation looks at a mid-rise corridor designation, which really provides a lot of that housing near those transit lines. And then the oranges and lighter yellows include neighborhood apartment and townhouses, which look to transition to those neighborhood areas and provide some higher density forms, and perhaps more of a ground-oriented or lower density, low-rise format. So this kind of shows you the continuum of the types of uses and the scale of development that's envisioned for these different areas. So everything from a center or center core, which I mentioned could be up to 18 stories, which is a village, which would be kind of in the 6 to 11-story range. Corridor hubs and corridor, which is more of a mid-rise development, and then the low-rise neighborhood apartment and urban townhome. And this is an example of what's contained in the plan with respect to the guidance that's given for each of these land use designations. So this is for the center core. It provides a bit of a description of what it's intended to do, the uses that are typically appropriate, how it will interact with the street, what kind of elements we're looking for, and then information on height and density. And then you can see the supporting map, which shows the location of those uses, and then a graphic which illustrates some of the key elements that are important to include. One important thing to note about the land use designations here is these really are policy for future decision making. So no change is initiated on any of these properties unless it's initiated by the property owner, and the approval process requires council approval to achieve new zoning that aligns with this policy. So even though this sets the vision for 20 years, a lot of this change will be much more incremental than it feels when you're looking at this map, and really initiated by that property owner to bring that forward to council for a decision. As I mentioned, the plan includes a number of different unique sub-areas. There's 8 in total here, and I'll briefly just go over them. And I think one of the most important things is for the policy to be effective, we need to respond to some of the local conditions. So each one of these sub areas has a special section that addresses policy for these areas. And that's critically important to look forward. So I'll just briefly go over the 8 sub areas. So these are the ones along the McKenzie corridor. So firstly, starting with McKenzie West, this is the area that joins the Pat Bay Highway and is sandwiched between Swan Lake and Christmas Hill. So this is an area that we've looked at a much tighter range of land use designations, trying to provide a bit of extra buffer space around those key environmental elements. Next, moving to the Quadra McKenzie Center. This is really the nexus of the McKenzie and Quadra corridors, and really probably one of the top 3 to 4 locations in Saanich in terms of regional draw and critical importance to our housing and employment visions. This is also the area where the Saanich Operations Center lies and where the Lochside Trail cuts through. So a lot of potential in this area to re-envision it, and some larger sites that will likely undergo redevelopment in the next 10 to 15 years. And the plan really provides an opportunity to articulate a vision of how we want those sites to redevelop. Brayfoot is the next sub area, and this lies adjacent to the Blenkinsop Valley. So there's that interface to think about in terms of agricultural land and the urban containment boundary, but also some great attributes to build on, such as Brayfoot Park and things like that. Interestingly, Blenkinsop and Cedar Hill Crossroad are identified as frequent transit routes in the longer term. So there's an opportunity to kind of build around those and leverage kind of not only the McKenzie Rapid Bus, but also those 2 routes. Next is the Shelburne McKenzie Center, and there's a fairly significant amount of redevelopment, either ongoing or planned to redevelop. So if you think of University Heights, the new Nellie McClung Library, so a lot of that has already taken place and likely will continue to happen as this area that includes those confluence of the 2 major transit routes as well. And lastly, Gordon Head Center, which I've mentioned before, but includes the redevelopment of some of the key UVic properties in that area. So Ian Stewart, VLOX, Fire Hall number 3. So that's one where we can really build that connection to UVic, but also really think about how that area changes as those larger scale properties redevelop. For the sub areas in Quadra, there's Quadra North, which connects up to the Pat Bay Highway and Royal Oak. For this area, it's largely single family right now, so we're looking to provide a greater diversity of housing options. There's a couple of hubs identified in this area around Chatterton and Beckwith Park. So looking at land use change over the longer term that allows more commercial and community uses. And yeah, but also recognizing that there's certain areas here where there's unique environmental or heritage features that we need to plan carefully around. Quadra McKenzie Center, which I already addressed previously, is part of the Quadra Corridor, and then Quadra South, which contains the Four Corners Village. So this area is adjacent to the City of Victoria and also the Uptown Douglas Plan area. Contains quite a substantial amount of multifamily development already, so a number of apartments and some really key commercial services at the Four Corners Village. So looking to further build on that and really revitalize the Four Corners Village area and provide some additional housing opportunities in this location that's proximate to a lot of amenities and transportation services. Here's an example of what our sub-area policy looks like. And if you're interested, you can look at this. So this is kind of a zoom in on those land use designations. So you can see what's envisioned over that 20-year future for each property. You can see areas where we've identified the special sites with the hatching. So there's specific policy objectives that are provided for those areas. We also have things such as the green areas, or areas where we're looking to prioritize the introduction of new public realm or open space. So think things like plazas. The dotted lines are where we're looking to, the black lines and dotted lines are where we're looking to introduce new pedestrian and cycling connections or new roads through the redevelopment process. One of the big challenges we have in Saanich is a lot of our development is kind of in that post-war period, built around cul-de-sacs. So some of the distances are short, but the actual real connectivity and walking distances is longer. So looking to build some additional connections there. So I'll briefly touch on the density framework, and this is something that as each project comes forward, one of the things that staff and council grapples with is what are the appropriate things to prioritize in the redevelopment of a project? Because oftentimes there's a plethora of competing interests, and in many areas we're really looking to achieve additional housing. But are there things that we can introduce to help incentivize some outcomes that we know are important in new developments? So this density framework provides a flexible approach that can respond to different site characteristics or project goals, and really focuses on a number of key areas around housing, environment, public realm, use, private amenity space, and heritage. This is a bit of a newer approach for Saanich, so it's separate from the plan right now and a pilot initiative. So we're really looking to get feedback on this and whether this is something that works, and certainly we'll be engaging with housing providers and others to get a sense of how well this might work. And briefly, one of the key elements is looking at the density on a specific site and what level would be supportable. So frequently with our plans and policies, we really focus on building height, but oftentimes you can have a taller building that has a high density or a lower density depending on how much site it covers. So the metric we use to evaluate density is called floor space ratio, or FSR. And there's an illustration here that shows how that materialized. So essentially the floor space ratio is the ratio of development to the site area. So in the example you see here, one FSR is basically where you have a one-story development covering the entire site. You could have the same density where you have a two-story development covering half the site, or a four-story development covering a quarter of the site. So density is one way that we can evaluate projects, and by providing greater increments of density for specific outcomes, it's one way that we can incentivize certain site outcomes that we see as favorable. And you're able to read more about this in the density framework. So essentially, how this works is each site would have a base density, and then they'd be able to achieve additional density based on the achievement of different outcomes, which would equal a total supportable density for the site. So essentially, it's a bit of like a menu approach where they'd be looking at, the base density on my site might be X, and if I retain high value trees, include a daycare and underground hydro, I can get to a higher density. So that's something that's there, and I realize this is probably a little bit of a complex piece here, but I encourage you to read that piece. And just showing also by the way of example here, for the center core designation, it shows what the base density would be, and then what a developer could potentially get up to as a maximum, depending on their site, and acknowledging that some of the major roads can take more development density than something that's smaller or within off of a major road. So these are the items that are identified as incentive areas, and the things that generally seem to be positive outcomes when developments come forward, and the kind of things that are part of that typical negotiation process with council and the approvals process. So from a housing perspective, really looking at below market housing units, units that are affordable or are not priced at the market rates. Family sized housing units, so 3+ bedroom units, which are more challenging to achieve in certain types of developments. So acknowledging the challenge there and trying to incentivize that. retention of high-value trees, and certainly in this area, there's a number of high-value trees that Gary oaks and others that are critical for retention. Canopy cover targets, so relating to our urban forest strategy, heritage retention designation, commercial or community uses, publicly accessible open space, pedestrian cycling connections, undergrounding utilities, and private amending space. So there's a range of things that could potentially achieve greater density. And one of the things we're seeking feedback on the survey is which of these items do you feel are worthy of that additional density or should be prioritized? So if you have a chance, please share that input. Moving on to the transportation elements of the plan, and firstly providing a little bit of framing, and then getting into some of the key directions, which I know a number of you are quite interested in. So Saanich has, through our Fish Community Plan, other documents, really made a deliberate choice to prioritize certain modes of transportation. And a lot of the work that we have in the Quadra McKenzie Plan and other documents looks to implement that direction. So you can see our mobility pyramid here, which puts walking at the top, cycling and micromobility second, public transit, goods movement, car share, and personal vehicles. So we really have that clear policy direction that we're trying to implement through this. Additionally, in our active transportation plan, we have policy support for changes that help to increase facilities for those different modes, and eventually move towards some pretty aggressive mode split targets. So if you see here, by 2050, we're looking to have 50% of all trips taken by means other than personal vehicles, so cycling, walking, and transit. So right now, in 2017, we're at about 23%. So there's some movement to be made, but we are trending in that direction over time. In the Quadra McKenzie plan, there's a couple of maps that really help to articulate some of the key framing elements around transportation. So first is the frequent and rapid transit lines. So McKenzie is identified as a rapid transit corridor. And if you can see the blue line there, that indicates that. And then the preferred stop locations, which are really nuclei for future housing and employment opportunities, given the proximity and the fact that that will be an extremely high level of service. We also have frequent transit corridors, which is Quadra, Cedar Hill, and Blenkinsop, and Tattersall, which are also critical corridors to build around, and Quadra Street being the primary one there. So similar to McKenzie, those areas that are identified for transit stops are really key nuclei to build around. The plan also looks to introduce new network connectivity through two mechanisms. Firstly, through adding new signals at key intersections. So this will help facilitate travel for all modes across some of these busier corridors, or primarily the busier corridors, and improve connection and safe access to a variety of destinations. And then, as I mentioned, the red lines, which are those new pedestrian and cycling connections, which will help shorten the distances between destinations and improve overall connectivity. And those will be largely implemented as properties redevelop. So briefly touching on the two main corridors that are addressed in the plan. So the McKenzie corridor, as I mentioned, a rapid transit corridor, connects UVic and provincial highways, and really is the primary east-west corridor in Saanich. So right now, a really critical vehicle cycling transit corridor. One of the things that we got when we're applying for this is what are some of the trends and what's been happening recently, and what's likely to happen in the future. So if you look at the shifts in modes that is happening, the rate of vehicle trips has actually been going down slightly over time, and we anticipate that will carry on. And if you're out there every day, it may not feel that way, but that's what the data says. And then transit and cycling and walking has been incrementally increasing, and through additional improvements, we anticipate that those modes will become even stronger over time, and that vehicle rates will dip slightly. So briefly, the future for McKenzie Avenue really looks at a focus on a range of different modes. So a lot of the improvements behind the curbs are dependent on properties redeveloping and dedicating additional space. So as that space is dedicated, we're able to have wider sidewalks, greater space for tree planting, and fully separated bike lanes. So that's the plan largely as properties redevelop, and you'll probably see that with some properties that have redeveloped already in terms of the difference in the quality of those facilities. Within the road right of way, the curb to curb space will largely stay the same, uh, and space will be converted to transit as ridership and demand increases. So as you can see in this cross section, which is maybe typical for intersections, there would be a travel lane in each direction and a central turn lane, as well as bus lanes on the outside. So largely the same, but over time, those vehicle lanes will be turned over to bus lanes. And one of the really unique features about that is there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how that's implemented. So it's not something where it has to be an all or nothing right away. There's a variety of approaches that can be taken in terms of looking at transit lanes at certain times of day, in certain segments of the corridor, or looking at certain priorities around intersections. So it's something that can be experimented with, and there's a range of different implementation choices that we have as we move along. But really critically looking to really cement this as a rapid transit corridor where travel times are are, are advantageous for transit vehicles. So relatively the same if you look at a mid-block circumstance. The only difference would be not everywhere would have a travel lane, or sorry, a turn lane. So, but fairly similar. Longer term, as properties redevelop, looking to have that double row of trees that allows us to meet some of our canopy cover targets that are identified in our urban forest strategy. And this is just an example of what that might look like. What that might look like at an intersection. So this is Borden and McKenzie, and as you can see, it's relatively similar to now, but there's transit lanes on either side, also functioning as right turn lanes. So there'll be ability as work progresses to look at these more detailed designs. The other key corridor that we're looking at is the Quadra corridor. So right now, this is a very high functioning transit corridor, 7-minute frequency. And important to note that the stops along the corridor are all used fairly heavily. So there's, in contrast to some other routes where, there's really key destinations, there's really fairly high usage all the way along this corridor. It provides that connection with the city of Victoria. Um, but also has long stretches where there's limited services and amenities. So the potential to really build around some of those future transit stops. Some of the key destinations on the corridor are the Four Corners Village and the Quadra McKenzie Center. So this is the vision for the Quadra corridor longer term, and a lot of what I said for McKenzie really does apply here as well in terms of the introduction of different transit priority measures. They can really be scaled up at a fairly incremental rate, and kind of really look at targeted areas or times initially, but longer term looking to have some transit priority in centers and villages, particularly where those are the areas where there's the greatest challenge around travel time. So if we can provide transit queue jumpers or other things that can really speed up the time. And similarly, as with McKenzie, a lot of the improvements behind the curb will happen as part of as property is dedicated through the redevelopment process. This provides the vision mid-block, which looks at one lane each way with a cycling lane on street with a smaller buffer area, and of course allowing for turning movements to access different properties. The last component I'll talk about the plan and briefly before we turn it over to questions is around the parks, open spaces, and community facilities. So we have the benefit of some hot off the presses documents, the urban forest strategy and the biodiversity conservation strategy, which are really critical guiding documents. So they've addressed a lot of the policy for Saanich at a district-wide level. So they will really inform any decisions that are made in this area. Having said that, a big part of what we're trying to do is also further implement some of those directions. And one of the big directions that we're trying to implement is the 330-300 principle, which says that all residents in Saanich should be able to see 3 trees from their house, live in an area with 30% canopy cover, and be within 300-meter walk of a park. So that's guided a lot of our analysis and policy directions in the plan, and included the reflection in the density framework around high value trees and canopy cover as key outcomes that we want to achieve. The plan also identifies locations for new public spaces, really focuses on Lochside Trail, and then from a community facility perspective, looking to really gain some better value out of some of our institutional sites, which are perhaps underused, so looking to expand the role of those sites. This is a map from the biodiversity conservation strategy. And one of the really important pieces of information that it provides is the location of habitat sites. So you can obviously see Swan Lake is a key habitat site, as is Christmas Hill. But there's other smaller patches here which are identified along the Quadra corridor in particular, and up here near McKenzie, that we've really factored into our land use designations, and also in some instances identified as special sites that require further careful consideration with any development. So a lot of the questions are kind of what happens next with the plan, and what does it mean for it to be adopted. So once the plan is adopted, it really will be the policy that guides future decision making. It will be aligned with our official community plan. So the Quadra McKenzie plan will be fully consistent with that, and really be used that frame for decision making around not only development but future capital projects. Important to note that a lot of the land use change in particular will only occur when initiated by property owners. So a lot of the elements of the plan are really dependent on that private investment to see those changes happen. Having said that, there's additional capital projects such as the revitalization of the Saanich Operations Center, or improvements to some of the key corridors that would be funded through Saanich, and more with partnerships of senior level governments or grant funding. After the plan is adopted, there's additional implementation measures that were required to amend our regulations to try to align with it, or to complete some of the detailed design around the higher level changes that are anticipated for the area. So this is one opportunity to kind of learn more about the project, but we also have a couple of open houses upcoming, one on Saturday and one on Tuesday, and then we have a survey that will be available until November 25th, so for about another month. We'll also have some pop-up events, so if you want to come talk to a staff member, please stay tuned to that website, and there'll be different events up for a couple hours at a time, and hopefully in your neighborhood or local area where you'll be able to pop in and maybe answer some of your questions. Certainly you can always send in emails, qms@saanich.ca as well, if you have any questions. So in terms of where the process goes from here, so this right now we're really fully focused on receiving feedback on the draft plan, the survey being the primary mechanism, and open till November 25th. After that, we'll be taking all of that public feedback, assessing what refinements and changes need to be made to the plan. That will ultimately lead to a kind of final draft proposed plan, which will be presented to council for consideration, and we're targeting spring of 2025 for that. And then once council considers that, there's kind of a formal adoption process, which will include a public hearing. So with that, happy to turn it over to questions.
So I'm just going to pop in here now. Thank you for your presentation, Cam. As Cam mentioned, we'll now be moving on to the question and answering period. A reminder on the process is that attendees can post the question using the text box in the submission button on the right of the page. Please upvote the questions with the highest priority for you. Cam will share the PowerPoint slides in reference to the question as he and our colleague Megan from engineering will work towards responding to your questions in an orderly fashion. We also ask folks to have some patience with us as we get to responding. As we know, there's going to be quite a few questions that will be popping up. And so we're going to give you a few minutes right now to post your questions into the chat, and then I will flag the starting of the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start answering questions here. So the first question is, it's stated that this plan is a result of extensive engagement. I have lived on Union Road for over 5 years and only heard about this a couple days ago. How was this engagement done? How was I not engaged? So good question, and that's always one of the challenges is trying to make people aware of um, projects as they're going on and potential changes. So firstly, glad that you're involved now and glad that you have an opportunity to provide input. The primary ways that we've been advertising our events is we typically send um, a mailer to every household in every household and business in the area. So that's gone out, I believe, 3 times throughout this process. We're actively advertising in social media, on the district website, Saanich News, and a range of different platforms there. So yeah, so we try to mail it out to folks, put it in conventional newspaper, put it in social media, get the word out through community associations and things like that. But do realize that sometimes people get missed, and thank you for being involved here. Okay, next question is regarding Beckwith Hub and the houses there. I heard something like no changes will be made unless initiated by the property owner and approved by council. Confirm nobody's getting nudged out of the neighborhood if they don't want to leave. That's correct, yeah. So unless unless someone willingly puts their property forward for redevelopment, no change would happen. So that would need to go through a formal rezoning and development process. So unless that's done, nothing would change. You're not, no land will be expropriated, or people will not be pushed out of their houses. The next question is, how will families facing expropriation be compensated for the loss of their homes? I think that's fairly similar. I'll read out the full question and then maybe add anything that was missing from the previous one. How will families facing expropriation be compensated for the loss of their homes and disruptions to their lives? What measures will be taken to support them during this difficult transition to help them rebuild their sense of community? So, yeah, really want to emphasize that the land use map that's shown in the designations there are longer term and meant to guide decision making. No one will be forced out of their home unless they voluntarily want to redevelop their property and come forward with an application to that extent. The only time sometimes where there's a minor bit of expropriation might be for a tiny bit needed for road improvements, but that's even quite unlikely in the Sandwich and wouldn't require a purchase of an entire property. So yeah, just to really emphasize that it really is at the volition of the property owner whether or not to redevelop. They would not be forced out of their house.
Okay, so this is Megan, and I have a question here. Is how we work with landowners where infrastructure such as multi pathways are proposed in the plan? And I think that's a conversation with landowners as we get into kind of the detailed design of the project. That's where those individual landowners will be brought into that conversation, and discussions will be had between the owners and the district of Sandwich about how that land will be dedicated for the multi-use pathway.
Sorry, Megan, if we can just jump in here. We're not able to hear you properly. If you can just redo that again and try again.
Sorry, Tammy, are you able to hear me now?
Try again.
No, I'm still trying. You're not hearing me?
It's better than it was before.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, you're good. You're good. I think it's better.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the question that I was asked was how we work with landowners where infrastructure such as multi-pathways are proposed in the plan. So, and this is a conversation with those individual landowners that will take place during the detailed design of the project. So once the plan is approved and once we move forward with detailed design, then those individual property owners will be contacted and brought into a conversation with such. Tammy, I'm just checking in. What was that?
So folks are still saying that they can't hear you and it's choppy and cutting out. Cam, maybe you can reiterate if you were able to hear.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of how will you work with landowners when infrastructure such as multi-use paths are proposed in the plan? So the primary way those multi-use paths would be implemented would be through a redevelopment process. So as a larger property redevelops, we usually ask for a dedication or right of way that allows us to introduce those. And as Megan referenced, if there's any impacts to property owners, that's part of the consultation, is to consult with them, notify, and if there's any decisions that need to be made, they would be part of that. But typically it would happen as part of a redevelopment process. I can maybe I'll try to answer some of the questions that are more germane to me, and then Megan can circle back on some of the other ones if that works. So there's a comment. I understand the need for future access to walking and public transit, particularly with potential trends over the next 23 years. However, the majority of commuters currently rely on cars. Why implement these changes now when the demand is not yet evident? I guess when we look at that one, there's a couple of different things to note. There is the demand is definitely there, and we have very clear policy directions around what we're trying to do, and those mode share targets that I shared earlier are something that we're trying to push. So we're trying to provide that infrastructure in place to allow us to meet those directions. Having said that, particularly when we look at McKenzie and Quadra, there's an ability to really flexibly implement some of those changes. So as I said, it's not an all or nothing thing. So as transit ridership increases, we can gradually increase the amount of transit priority measures. But at the outset, that can be more incremental and in line with transit demand and vehicle demand. Oftentimes, it's a couple of intersections that are really the critical pinch points, and if we can address those, a lot of times those go a long way to meeting those goals. The next question is, the only 2 parks in the area are already overused. Where are the new parks? So there are much more than 2 parks in this area. We do have some tools to acquire new parks, including through our development cost charge program. That are my specific parks that are needed in high growth areas. So there are some in this area. And then the other thing we're looking to do is, as some of those larger sites redevelop, we're looking to get smaller scale park spaces like plazas and things like that really contribute to that overall network of park spaces. So having the larger ones, be it natural ones like Swan Lake or recreational ones like Brayfoot, but also smaller scale parks and plaza spaces which serve other functions. Okay, next question is, how will the densification involving high-rise developments with retail fronts at key intersections, e.g. Shelburne and McKenzie, be healthy and safe for families, and not just a great developer opportunity? So I guess in terms of how they'll be healthy and safe for families, there's a lot of attention that goes in when we have those projects in terms of establishing that proper interface between the street and the building. So looking at things like setbacks, widths of sidewalks, how building entrances interact with the street. So those are really carefully considered, and looking at potential conflicts with walking or cycling. And there's really a detailed design process there. And then I think it's also a matter of the design of those ones, including things like private amenity space, so to allow families and others to live there, and having the right selection of bedroom units as well. Megan, are you good to go now?
Sorry, can you hear me now? How's that sound?
Sounds great, yeah. If you could maybe loop back to question 5 there.
Sure. So sorry about the technical difficulties. So question number 5 is, how and when was the data gathered to show the trend of vehicle per hour decrease and the walking and cycling increase on McKenzie Avenue? So District of Saanich partnered with BC Transit to do a study on McKenzie Avenue to look at, sort of gather that data that was necessary to tell us where the priority areas were going to be for transit and what the existing use was like and where the demand was going to be in the future. So I don't have the details on where and when that data was gathered, but I think it's a great question. I'd probably direct you to put it in an email, and then we can certainly gather that information to provide back to you. Question number 6, I understand the need for future access to walking and public transit, particularly with potential trends over the next 25 years. However, the majority of commuters currently rely on cars. Why implement these changes now when the demand has not yet evident? And I think it's a great question. I think what we're talking about here is a 20-year vision for McKenzie Avenue and for Quadra Street. And certainly what this plan envisions is significant more population in this area. And as that density goes up, the demand for mobility, ability to move through this area is also going to go up. So we are going to see population increase and a higher demand for people to be able to move around. And we are looking for ways to try and transition that mobility to our active modes and to the use of transit as a way to kind of shift people out of personal vehicles and into more efficient modes that will allow people to get from from where they live to their particular destination. But you've touched on an interesting point, because I think the changes that are proposed are going to happen incrementally and over time as we see the population grow, and as the land use changes start to take form, then the changes into the transportation network will also follow suit. Question number 6 I have here. I understand the need for future access to walking and public transit, particularly with potential, oh, I just did that one, sorry. Actually, just scrolling down here. Okay, so McKenzie Avenue is very congested now. How can you take away a lane in each direction and not have gridlock? We have it on Cedar Hill Crossroad and McKenzie and Shelburne, where lanes are narrowed. So again, the plan is not to take away travel lanes immediately, but to dedicate some of the space in certain sections of McKenzie Avenue to bus priority. And again, sort of trying to encourage and make it possible for more people to travel by transit, which is our more efficient and safe mode. And hopefully, if people are traveling by transit, then the congestion on McKenzie Avenue will be reduced. And so that, but again, it's sort of an incremental change that will be coming to this corridor. So certainly not going to happen overnight and all at once. And the transit priority will be in certain segments of the corridor, not the entire length. And I think, Cam, you're next.
Okay, so a couple ones here. Can you please tell us more about the identified hubs and Beckwith Hub? What are the timelines, and what does it look like for homeowners whose property shows as no longer existing in the plan? So I think those are two different questions, and the first one is the timeline for the hubs is really dependent on when property owners come forward with development proposals. So those will largely be formed as those properties redevelop. And certainly we have, clear policy here that would say, if this property redevelops, we want to see a commercial use or the scale of development. So it would be dependent on that. And there's a range of different factors that go into that in terms of, the viability of certain properties to redevelop, whether you're able to assemble a property large enough to facilitate a multi-family building. So that would happen at variable rates. And as those change happen, standards would also look at doing improvements to intersection areas and other things to supplement that. The second part of that question was, what does it look like for homeowners whose property shows no longer existing in the plan? So I think that's probably referring to the land use map and some white areas that are kind of outside the plan now. So those are areas that would be subject to Sanch's other regulations. So many of you are familiar with the small scale multi-unit housing regulations, where basically on any single family lot, you can build up to 4 units. So that's likely the regulations that would apply there. It may also be impacted by another study like the Shelburne Valley Action Plan or something like that. But largely those areas, and depending on specifically where they are, would likely just be subject to our citywide regulations. Next question is, with the announced upcoming closures of the UVic ice rink and pool, has any consideration taken place for replacing these community facilities that will be lost? So yeah, it's a good question, and those are facilities that have been used quite a bit by the community. Certainly they've been held by UVic, so in kind of that private facility that's had that public access. So there's a couple different ways that that could potentially be addressed over the long term. Saanich is doing an exploratory study at Lambrick Park, looking at the feasibility analysis of an ice rink there. So that's one thing that we're exploring. It's also important to note that UVic is right now doing a master planning process for the Ian Stewart VLOX Fire Hall number 3 sites. So there could potentially be some opportunities there, and encourage you to get involved with those conversations with UVic. And then we also have larger facility demand studies, which look at our facilities and identify areas. But the Lambert Park and the potential redevelopment of those major sites owned by UVic are kind of the big ones right now.
Okay, so there's a question here about, are you suggesting larger sidewalks? If yes, why? So we are suggesting wider sidewalks, and it will, depending where you are along the corridor, either McKenzie or on Quadra, that will be a different width. And I think there are a number of reasons why larger sidewalks are desirable. They create more space for pedestrian use. So again, as we see density in these areas increase, we anticipate that more people will be using the sidewalks and traveling on those sidewalks, either to reach a destination or to access transit. So creating additional space for people to move and to move easily. And one of the things that if you are out on those corridors today, you'll notice that it can be difficult for two people to pass each other on those sidewalks and feel safe because the sidewalks are immediately adjacent to the travel lanes. So creating additional space for pedestrians to move comfortably, for two pedestrians to walk side by side, or for people using mobility aids to travel comfortably and safely on the sidewalks. I think the other thing to understand is that sidewalk space also creates other opportunities for things like amenities. So we have the ability to put benches, bike racks, create additional space for people who are queuing and waiting for buses. So all of that additional space will be utilized by the additional number of people that we anticipate in the area.
So the next question here, is there a limit to the corridor building heights? I don't want to see a tunnel of high rises down Quadra McKenzie destroying the vistas over valley between the peaks of Christmas Hill, Mount Doug, and Mount Tomey. So typically for the corridors, the maximum building height would be 6 stories. And there are design guidelines to ensure that the actual size of the building is controlled. So there will be gaps in between those buildings. Certain areas will be looking for kind of lower footprint buildings to preserve habitat sites for environmental areas. So generally more of a mid-rise form in those areas, with the exception of the areas around centers like Quadra McKenzie and Shelburne McKenzie, where buildings could be up to 18 stories in certain locations.
Okay, so there's a question here. Are there plans in place between municipalities to improve public transit? It seems difficult to accept the removal of 50% personal vehicle activity in Saanich when travel between Victoria as a whole is not set up in a way to lose personal vehicles. So I would just say, with respect to transit, it's a regional initiative. So as we're having conversations with BC Transit about increasing service in our municipality, those conversations are also happening in Victoria and in Esquimalt, in other parts of the region. And so it is, I would say, certainly being approached on a regional scale in terms of how we more efficiently move people in our municipality and between our municipalities.
Next question here is, does Saanich seek through this plan to prioritize key areas for short-term development, or does Saanich see the whole area as a prioritized growth area? It's a good question. I would say generally when you look at the land use designations, the properties that are identified for more intense growth are generally areas of greater priority. A lot of times those land use changes allow us to improve public realm areas and really address kind of areas where there's transit and services in close distance. So those are the areas that are generally prioritized, but overall it looks to set that long-term framework for the whole area, and any applicant could come in for any property at any time. The other thing to note is that as we work through some of our implementation tools, including through things such as potentially incentives or or pre-zoning, we could further prioritize areas through that as well. So there's a long-term vision, but some of those implementation tools in the shorter term could help to further prioritize certain areas.
Okay, so next question is, my kids already don't have sidewalks for walking to school. With increased density, will more sidewalks be built? So I would say I would sort of direct you to look at our active transportation plan, and we have a long-term sidewalk network plan, which shows sort of the extent of the sidewalk network that is planned for Saanich. And a number of our streets, I don't know exactly which street or which area we're talking about, but a number of our streets do have sidewalks planned. But I will sort of say that there are other and I think providing that sidewalk space for kids traveling to and from school is very important to us. But there are other ways that we're also improving safety and making it safe for kids who are walking and cycling to school. So again, I would direct you sort of to the active transportation plan to look at what the network plans are in terms of sidewalks and improving our sidewalk coverage across the district. Sorry, I see the next one is for me as well. So what about emergency vehicles who can't get through? So I think in terms of the corridors, McKenzie Avenue and Quadra, there will be space for emergency vehicles to move along these corridors. I mean, they're currently moving along these corridors at peak times of the day and at busy times of the day when there's a lot of vehicle traffic already, and they are making their way through. They are sort of getting to where they need to go quickly and efficiently. And so the proposed cross sections for those roads still envision the ability for emergency vehicles to move quickly and efficiently through that space, and arguably in some cases where we have a bus lane identified, that will become space that could be used by emergency vehicles to bypass other vehicles if they're approaching an area where there's particular congestion.
So next question is, you mentioned 30% canopy cover in the future plan. Does that apply to all areas, and what is the current canopy cover for this area? So the 30% is related to that 330-300 principle. Our urban forest strategy has a much more in-depth breakdown of what areas should be achieving what canopy cover targets. And the goal for Saanich as a whole is 44% canopy cover by 2064. One important thing to recognize about that is those areas outside the urban containment boundary are going to contribute much greater amount to that canopy cover than areas inside, particularly.
Oh, Cam, you're muted or something happened.
Yeah, did the first part of that answer come?
It did.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So so that's our general goal, is to hit 30%. But in primary growth areas, which this is actually 20%. But I think we're striving for that 30%. The 20% is kind of the floor, and the 30% is what we're striving for. And then for Saanich as a whole, we're looking at 44%. So sorry for the long-winded answer there. The next question is, the abundance and diversity of large old trees and green spaces makes this such a great area to live. Can you speak to what you have called high-value trees and what the overall plan is to retain large trees amid the density growth in Saanich? It's a great question, and something that we've been thinking about a fair bit. So the high-value trees is a definition that was recently developed to really identify those trees which are of a certain size, species, and health that are really provide significant ecological benefits and are something that are prioritized for retention. And that's the first priority of our urban forest strategy, is to retain existing trees. So we've recently identified that. We're still doing more work to really define that in a much more detailed way. And there's a couple of different ways that we're looking to retain those trees. First is to really provide clear definitions so we can say when an applicant comes in, you have 6 high value trees on your sites. These are ones that we'd like to try to preserve if possible. So there's a couple different ways. One, by providing incentives for the preservation of those through our density framework, and then in areas where we know that there's a collection of those high value trees. We've identified those as special sites and would prefer buildings with smaller footprints to help preserve those. So we've identified special sites, provided those density incentives, and then also we have a number of policies in the plan around varying things like setbacks to help preserve those trees where possible. The next question is, we are new to the process, but wondering what is planned for the KEG and the adjoining land. So that those properties are within the Quadra McKenzie Center. So we're looking at higher density within those properties. There's a number of different considerations there in terms of the adjacency to the Lochside Trail and some of the existing heritage buildings there. So that's probably one of the more complex sites to work through. But in general, we're looking for kind of a higher density use there with a mix of housing and employment uses. I think that particular parcel is designated for up to 12 stories in the plan. Next question is, I love the alignment between land use and transportation illustrated in the plan. Could the plan's land use happen without the focus on multi-mobility on the collectors? I.e., is it even possible to have this density if we remained auto-oriented? It's a good question, and I think a lot of the plan does rely on people taking alternate modes, so transit, walking, cycling. We don't have plans to increase our road capacity, so a lot of it is around people taking those different modes and ensuring that we make those modes an attractive and reasonable option for people to take as throughout their daily lives. So yeah, I think the two go hand in hand. We need to improve walking, cycling, and transit facilities. At the same time, we bring in new housing options. And in many instances, when we actually have those redevelopment proposals, it allows us to improve sidewalk facilities, improve cycling facilities, add car share vehicles to properties, things like that, that can really mutually reinforce one another.
Okay, and I think this might be our last question here. So the Four Corners Village is already very congested, especially along Cook Street. Cook is not part of the Quadra corridor, so why is Cook included in this? The long-term vision is that there will be changes at that intersection to address some of the congestion that is there. So some alignment changes, as well as some changes to add transit priority at that intersection and to create protection for cyclists and pedestrians moving through that area. But when we look at changes to an intersection, we sort of look at the spillover or the reciprocal effects of those changes to traffic patterns. And so just a small portion of Cook Street is included in the plan area for the purpose of sort of addressing kind of the I guess the traffic patterns that will result as changes happen at that intersection and along Quadra Street, and to ensure that any changes that we're making along Quadra Street are tied in properly to the sort of the surrounding street network in the area.
Okay, folks, it's now just over 1:30, and that concludes the allotted time we had for the webinar. And we did try to address a number of the questions being asked, and those that weren't answered will be posted online under an FAQ section on our webpage. As far as next steps go, we'll be presenting the same information this evening, so please refer to our webpage for registration and dates and times of upcoming consultation this week and the following week. As always, we appreciate your feedback and want to encourage you to continue to stay involved and engaged in the overall Quadra McKenzie plan and process by registering for our campaigner email list at saanich.ca/QMS and registering for our open houses and webinars. If there's a preferred method of communication, please email us to let us know at qms@saanich.ca. Thank you again for participating and staying engaged. Have a good day.